Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very empowering show coming right up with special guest Paul O'Brien, and he's here today to share with us his new book, Intuitive Intelligence: Make Life-Changing Decisions with Perfect Timing. Now, Paul left an executive position in high tech to invent a new category of multimedia software in 1989, which later evolved into eventually becoming the world's largest astrology and divination website in 2003. He's the author of 3 books and is a highly sought-after speaker, visionary entrepreneur, author, and founder of the Divination Foundation. So let's welcome to the show, Paul O'Brien.
Thank you, Marianne. I'm happy to be here.
What an honor it is to have you here. My goodness, you've been such a visionary when it comes to just the enlightenment, empowerment field. I think a lot of people look at you and go, gosh, this is a place I need to be to get my information. Now we've got this book.
Well, that sounds good to me.
Well, hey, why don't you share with us the inspiration behind writing this book? Because I know you have several others.
Well, I've got 3 books, but this book is really an important legacy work for me because it tells my story and also shares what I've learned along the way in terms of using intuition to guide the most important decisions in our lives. And so I'm very excited that it's coming out now and that it's being published by Beyond Words, because it's just my way of giving back. I mean, I've got this story built into the book. It's not a memoir, but it's part memoir. And it's the story of the most unlikely business expense. It's like one of business success. It's one of those do what you love and the money will follow type of stories. And I'm a little shy about telling my own story, but then I thought so many people encouraged me, you got to write this up. So that's basically the backstory of the book.
Well, I'm glad you shared that with us. A lot of times it's interesting just to see what kind of challenges that we're faced with when we're coming to different levels of success. And you've really done that with this book.
Well, thank you. It's not been a linear path, that's for sure. I mean, we go 3 steps forward, 1 step back. But it's really, in my case, I was on a career path as a software high-tech marketing guy. And I left that career in order to do something that was closer to my heart. It's the story of a man who left money for meaning. I wanted to do something meaningful and hope that I could scratch a living out of it. And then, 15 years later, I had developed what became the world's largest astrology website. And it was all just a bunch of synchronicities that lined up. And there was a lot of use of intuition, and there was a lot of receiving great advice along the way. And so I thought, I should share this with people because I've created this personal success. And so I talk about success in the book and what does it mean and how do you define it for yourself rather than just assuming that it means what everybody else thinks it means. And so for me, it meant all I really wanted to do was make a living doing something I cared about. That was my definition of success. It was very modest. It didn't involve making a lot of money. I wasn't money motivated. I basically wanted to do something that was meaningful for me and see if I could make a living at it. And it turned out that the money came anyway. It was amazing the way it happened, even though I struggled for 15 years to keep it all together. So it's a story of using intuition and learning to depend on your own resourcefulness in order to go down an entrepreneurial path. But it applies to any aspect of life. My visionary decision-making system, which is what I teach in the book, applies to relationships. It applies to career. It applies to any goal that you or desire that you want to manifest. So it's basically about getting what you want and making the right moves at the right time along the way. So it's about decision-making and timing.
Well, we're going to dive a little bit more into that in a little bit. I don't want to get too far ahead here because I would love you to explain for our listeners what intuitive intelligence really is.
Well, intuitive intelligence is basically your ability to access your intuitive sense when you need it most. And that's not so easy, because usually when we need it most is when we're stressed out or we're under the sway of very strong emotions, whether it's fear or desire or craving. And so it's very difficult to access your intuition because it's a very subtle sense. They've called it the sixth sense for 1,000 years. And that's because it's kind of an instinctive way of knowing that transcends linear logic. Now, I'm all for logic, but I don't think some of the biggest problems in life are very amenable to a logical formula. Questions that have to do with relationships or vocation or negotiations. These are things that really need to be led by intuition. And how do we develop our intuitive intelligence? We all have it. And so some of us can develop it more quickly or more effectively than others. But I see it as a higher form of intelligence that basically is more in tune with your soul than your ego. In fact, the ego is no good at intuition. It's good at many things, and it's a useful construct, but intuition really demands that we go beyond the noise of the chattering mind and all of the inputs of the five senses. So we really it's a very difficult thing to access, our intuitive intelligence, and that's why it's worthy of a book. And that's why I wrote the book.
Well, I'm glad that you did write this book so people can learn how to make that connection, because it really is that fine tuning to get to the place and really finding out where that intuition is really speaking to you.
Exactly. It's so hard because, like I said, when we tend to think that the stronger the feeling, the more compelling it is as a basis for decision making. But I have this thing I call O'Brien's Law, where it states the stronger the feeling, the less reliable and trustworthy it is as a criteria for decision making, because intuition doesn't show up as a strong feeling or a loud voice. It's a subtle sense. It's like we have these antennae that are attached to our mind, and the five senses. If you can think of it as like the palm of your hand is your mind, and the five fingers are the five senses, and they're streaming in, they're downloading tons of information, visual, auditory, etc. But imagine there's this sixth little finger, much smaller than the little finger, which is another antenna, but it's calibrated to a very fine, a very subtle signal. And it's very hard to hear it. There's so much noise on the line from the other five senses and all the chattering inside the mind itself. So it's sort of like in the old days when they had ham radios, and you're trying to tune in a signal from Bora Bora, and there's all this noise and static, etc. And you've got to do this fine tuning and try to find this very delicate signal. Intuition's kind of like that. We have to tamp down the noise in the system, and so that requires certain skills that I teach in the book that make it possible to do that.
Well, in your book, you also talk about perfect timing. Why is that so important?
Well, they say timing is everything, and timing is the most difficult thing. And why is that? Well, let's say that you want to make a strategic decision. You want to think about making a career change, or you want to think about, entering into an intimate partnership with somebody, or whatever the big decision is that you have to make. I call it a strategic decision. I'm not talking about all the small decisions about which toothpaste to buy and that kind of thing. I'm just talking about the life-changing decisions and how can we bring intuition to lead the way forward for that kind of thing. So when you have a strategic decision, you got to answer two questions. Well, you got to answer three questions, really. And in the book, I've got a separate chapter for each of those questions. The first one is, who am I? What am I good at? What do I love to do? What fascinates me? What naturally fascinates me? These are really germane questions when it comes to livelihood or vocation, because many times we're steered in a direction. You got to choose a major and declare a career at age 19, and then you're going to go 50 grand in debt behind it, and you don't even know yourself. So the first step is self-knowledge, self-discovery. That's the who question. Then there's the what question. And the what question is, okay, what do I want to commit myself to? What do I want to learn? What path do I want to go on? What is it that I want? That's the what question. Now, logic can help with that. In fact, logic can do a lot of good. And I've got a chapter on the what question and a logic technique that's much better than pros and cons, but it's just as simple. And there's some intuition involved in that, but it's mostly logic. And then there's the when question. So logic, the what question tries to answer the question, what is the best move I can make? And then the when question is, when should I make it? When should I execute on that choice? And that's the timing question. And that one is 100% intuitive. And that's why it's so difficult, because people can't access their intuition very easily without some training, in mindfulness, without some I have a chapter on divination and how that can help. So there's these techniques that I have in the book that help people open up to their intuition so that they can have a better sense of timing. And people ask me, well, how can you use this phrase perfect timing? And I help them understand the synchronicity principle, which Carl Jung explained when he was studying the I Ching and tarot cards. He was studying divination. And the synchronicity principle says that there are no accidents, that everything happens for a reason, that everything's connected in time as well as in space. Well, we don't tend to know that. We're not taught that in school. In fact, in science, we're taught that timing doesn't matter. You do this controlled experiment on Tuesday night, and if you do that same controlled experiment on Friday morning, you're going to get exactly the same result. It doesn't matter what time you do it or about the timing of it. But the ancient sages, they knew that timing was important, and they were trying to answer a different question than modern science is asking. They were asking the question, what kinds of things want to go together in time? And so they became very attuned to the seasons, to the constellations. They invented astrology as a way of trying to get in sync with the tenor of the times in order to do things at the right time. That's the timing question. So perfect timing just means understanding synchronicity and noticing the synchronicities that happen in your life, all these amazing coincidences, and letting them be a signal for you and paying attention to them. I have a technique in the book called a synchronicity journal, where you keep track of all these amazing coincidences that your logical mind just tends to want to dismiss. The ego just wants to say, oh, that was just a coincidence. But no, Carl Jung defined synchronicity as a meaningful coincidence. Well, how do you find the meaning in coincidence? That's where intuition comes in. Intuition is that sensitive little antenna that can sense these synchronicities and make sense of them. So that's why timing is so difficult, is because we're not in sync. We're completely out of sync. We're doing what we were told to do. We're believing what we were told to believe, and our self-discovery is weak, and that sort of limits our ability to honor our dreams.
Well, and I love having that journal where people can write down when these synchronicities happen, because as you're saying, like a lot of times people just write it off like, oh, that's no big deal. And then they forget, how many of these are taking place during their day or their week or their month.
It's like a lot of little miracles are happening all the time. And unless we're paying attention, unless we're sensitized to that, we don't even notice.
Yeah, it's easy to get that tuned out, It's like, oh, it's just a synchronicity,
Yeah, it's just a coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, and earlier in our discussion, you talked about, visionary decision making, and I would love for you to expand on that for our listeners.
Well, this is a book, Intuitive Intelligence is a book about decision making. And I'm basically talking about how to access intuition, but I'm doing it in a very pragmatic way. I'm saying, here's how you can apply intuition to your decisions, because the decisions we make are the most powerful thing we do. In fact, I make the point that decision-making is the highest leverage human skill there is. It's what differentiates us from other species. And you'd think that as the only species we know of that can visualize different possible outcomes to different choices we might make, that we would be really good at this. But au contraire, we suck. we are either too emotional and impulsive, or we're too rational and procrastinating while we wait for more information. But either way, we've got to learn how to make better decisions, because if we start making even slightly better decisions, everything is going to unfold much more smoothly and much more successfully. The secret to success and happiness in life lies in the quality of the decisions that you make. And so I call it visionary decision making. Why? Because it depends upon a vision. You have to have self-knowledge and a vision that stems from that. What were you fascinated by? And did you allow yourself to explore that pathway? Like, for instance, in my life, I was fascinated by two things when I was in college. I was fascinated by the I Ching, which is this ancient divination system. Some people call it the I Ching. And I was fascinated by this up-and-coming phenomenon known as software. Well, in those days, nobody knew what software was. And I had a friend who had a job at a computer center. He was the programmer. And this computer center had a computer called a mini computer that would take up this whole room and have gigantic mag tapes on a card reader and a tiny little terminal the size of an oscilloscope. And we'd go there late at night. And this was in Eugene, Oregon. It was a nonprofit research institute. We'd go there late at night and we'd play this game on this gigantic $150,000 computer that had less power than my iPhone has now. And we play this little game that my friend downloaded from MIT using ARPANET, which was the very first rendition of the internet. And we play this game. Well, I've never been much of a gamer, but I was just enthralled by the idea that some programmers at MIT had created this experience, this experiential software that was very immersive, and it would draw you in, and you'd play this game, and it was one of the very earliest games. It was called Space War, and it didn't really amount to much. It was just pixels on a screen shooting photon torpedoes at each other. And I didn't really care about the gaming aspect. I was just enthralled by the whole phenomenon of software and the whole idea that you could write code and deliver an experience. And I was having visions in the early 70s of multimedia and the capacity of software to possibly deliver educational experiences or spiritual experiences. Well, so I got into the software business. I got a job at that computer center as a secretary. I was a college dropout, and I didn't have credentials to get any better job than that. And I became the typist for the computer center and answering the phones. And that's how I broke into the software business. Well, within 10 years, I was the vice president of marketing for a high-tech company. And 15 years after I got that first software job, I was an executive for this high-tech firm here in Portland, but I was very unhappy. And I found myself using the I Ching more often than usual just to calm myself down. It's kind of it's a divination system that uses the synchronicity principle and a set of archetypes, like tarot cards. Each tarot card is an archetype. And I would use it. Every one of those archetypes is inside of you. The I Ching's got 64 chapters, 64 archetypes. And I would use it just to sort of like calm down, because it would help me get more perspective, a wider perspective on my situation, which was very uncomfortable. And then one day at work, a light bulb went off and I went, wow, I wonder if a software version of this would make any sense. And I started to visualize how multimedia with sounds and art, and this was before CD-ROMs were even out yet. This was 1988. And I was starting to visualize how multimedia might be possible to create some kind of ritual space where you could give yourself an I Ching reading and in a state of mind that was more meditative and calmed down, so that you could get a really authentic reading and use the mouse and the keyboard to cast the coins, which is usually the way people do the I Ching. It's a book and a set of coins. So I just became just obsessed with this idea, which was the intersection of two things I had been fascinated with for 20 years. And so this is what I try to help people understand in terms of self-knowledge. No matter how old you are, ask yourself, what naturally fascinated you when you were in stage one of life, the student stage, during your 20s, during your late teenage years? What fascinated you? And ask yourself, is there some way that I could explore that now? Or maybe find an intersection between two things that fascinated me. So that's kind of how it happened for me. And then I started a company to publish I Ching software. Well, Marianne, this was like the dumbest business idea ever. All my peers thought I was crazy. I was leaving a high-paying executive position with a career that was going places in order to do this strange thing that they didn't understand. And it really was a kind of a crazy business idea because there was no market for it. People who knew what the I Ching was weren't buying software in 1989, and people who bought software could care less. They were accountants and engineers at that point in time. But I did it out of love. I did it because it held meaning for me. And I thought, well, I'm a marketing guy. If anybody can sell this, it ought to be me. And maybe I can eke a living out of it. My goal was creative freedom. And I defined that very modestly as being able to make a living doing something I cared about. And so I set out to do that. Well, it was rough going, and it was way ahead of its time, obviously. And that first company all of a sudden I was the accidental entrepreneur. I had no investors. I had no family money. I just had my savings, and I was doing consulting at night. So I had two jobs. I was moonlighting, and I was developing this very strange software program. And I also had to write a version of the I Ching because I didn't have the rights to any of the ones that were out there. And I wanted to make it better. I wanted to make it less patriarchal and less militaristic. So that was my first book, but I wrote it for the software. So I was and I was a single father. So I was a busy guy, and I was working, 70, 80 hours a week for many years and didn't pay myself half the time because I couldn't. I wanted to pay my staff for sure. So anyway, when CD-ROMs came around, I made a CD-ROM version of it, and then I added a do-it-yourself tarot card reading program. And then when the internet came around, I got the domain name tarot.com and iching.com, and I started trying to sell CD-ROMs that way. And then I decided to develop a pay-to-play type of thing, and we charge people for a do-it-yourself tarot card reading. And then AOL picked it up, and then I added astrology, and then AOL picked that up. That was a very competitive thing, but I got the franchise. And as a result of that, by the middle of the 2000s, I had 10 million registered members going to my site, tarot.com, and it was the world's largest astrology website at that time. We also provided all the horoscopes for Yahoo. So it became huge, and all of a sudden, I was paying myself and actually making a lot of money, and we started being pursued by large media companies. Disney came up. They wanted the horoscopes for all of their women's channels. Barnes & Noble was interested. And I said, oh, no, this is fine. I'm doing fine. I'm finally making money, and I've got more creative freedom than ever. And we had about 40 products, different astrology reports and different tarot card readings. And then I asked myself, well, and they kept coming because they could see we had a lot of traffic, and we had a female demographic, which was very desirable. And so I finally asked myself, what would I do if I sold the company? And I realized, well, I would have even more creative freedom because I'd have a lot more time if I got my number such that I didn't have to work other than as an investor. And so I thought, well, I'll start a nonprofit, and I've got some books in me, and I got some traveling I want to do. So that's how the Divination Foundation, which is the name of my nonprofit, got started, and which we continue to this day. And it's just a way for me to give back. So this book, all the proceeds from Intuitive Intelligence, the book, and from my visionary I Ching app, which is a I Ching program for iPhones and Android phones, all the proceeds go to the Divination Foundation and support our work in terms of my podcast and in terms of my blogs, etc. And so from a point of view of creative freedom, who could have imagined that I was going to become a multimillionaire from a company that started the way mine did, with this crazy little I Ching program that I called Synchronicity back in the late 80s. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell.
I'm glad that you shared that with us because it really puts into perspective. Because a lot of times when people are looking, at success, they want to look at a person's story. and how they got from one level to another. And you really followed, your heart in many ways and your intuition in regards to how to take the next step and how to move forward.
I think that's a very good point that you make. It's about the heart. It's about being true to your heart and finding your heart and being true to it and being willing to take risks that are in alignment with what you really care about. I have my favorite slogan is take the risks that grow you. I didn't have any reason to believe that I Ching software was ever going to amount to anything in terms of a business or financially. But I knew that I would learn so much and that I would be developing a part of myself that really wanted to become, wanted to give back to the I Ching itself. I had used the I Ching my entire adult life to help me make better decisions. It's called divination. There's a chapter in the book on it. And for people who are vaguely interested in divination, I think that chapter in the Intuitive Intelligence book is pretty good in terms of explaining it for lay people and telling them the usefulness of it. And I define divination as a way to stimulate your intuition, to think outside the box around problems that logic can't handle. And there's a lot of problems and decisions that logic alone can't handle, as I said before, relationships, vocation, negotiations, and every timing issue. So I promote the use of authentic divination as a way to stimulate your intuition around decision making. There's a lot of other ways you can use intuition, but I'm being very pragmatic in this book. I'm trying to help people achieve success in their own terms, like I did on the business front. And so that's my hope, is that by giving back, by having written this book, by having produced a Western version of the I Ching, and through the ongoing work of the Divination Foundation, I can help the world in my own small way.
Well, we're so glad you're doing what you're doing, and what a just remarkable story, because it takes a lot of courage to be able to follow a path where you're not seeing where that's going.
Well, it reminds me of that book. I interviewed the author of the book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And the old expression is, there's two kinds of people. Some people are afraid and go for it, and other people are just afraid. So I think if you can find what your heart cares about and let your heart lead the way rather than your ego, you can overcome the fears that are going to be there, because you're going to be afraid. You're going to be nervous. Anytime we're a nervous species. Primates are a nervous species, but we're also a curious species. And we have a lot of heart. And so if we can learn to get above this black and white thinking of success and failure and the fear of failure and the impatience for success. Like I said, I went 15 years getting paid half the time. I mean, financially, it was a struggle, but I was buoyed by my love for what I was doing. I was just so fascinated by it. It wasn't that I thought it was ever going to amount to anything very lucrative, but I had to do it. I felt it was my calling to do it. And that was basically because of my heart, like you said. And I just really encourage people to get to know themselves and figure out what turns them on, what fascinates you, what inspires you.
We can definitely use more people who find that spark within themselves, because how often do people, and I've talked to, hundreds of people, and they would say, I'd ask them, do you like your job? And most of them would say, no, I actually hate it. So to be able to do something that fascinates you and that you're passionate about, I mean, how great would that be?
It's a wonderful thing, but I always counsel people, don't disparage your day job too much. It's not everybody's destiny to be able to make a living doing only what they love. In fact, the people that do make a living doing what they love have to do a lot of things they don't love. They've got to pay taxes. They've got to manage people. They've got to manage the managers, even the big creative artists, Britney Spears. I mean, she's got to manage her man. She's got 5 managers or whatever. She's got to manage those people. There are aspects of life that we have to deal with that aren't fun, but it's our responsibility to take care of business. And so I like to say to people, honor your day job. If you have a day job that doesn't cause harm to the planet or to other people or to yourself, that's okay. That's a good thing. We got to pay the rent. We've all got to do something to pay the rent. We don't have to say, well, I'm not going to do it. I meet a lot of millennials and I mentor a lot of people. And so many times people say, I don't want to do anything that I'm not passionate about. And I say, well, look, you're 24 years old. Your brain hasn't even stopped growing yet. This is not the point where you should make a lifetime commitment to anything. This is the point when you should be trying things. This is stage one. This is experimental. This is trial and error. And in the meantime, you got to pay the rent. Unless you want to live in your parents' basement. I mean, I really encourage people to honor their day job, and there's nothing shameful about it. It's a very important thing. When I started my entrepreneurial career, like I said, I did consulting for 3 years, and it was a lot of work, and it wasn't fun. And I never really loved the 15 years I spent as a salesman and a marketing guy, but boy, did I learn some skills that came in handy later. So that's what I say, go apprentice yourself to somebody. Forget about, becoming a billionaire by the time you're 30 or winning on American Idol. Discover what you're good at and what you love to do and apprentice yourself to somebody and be willing to pay your dues. I was a number 2 for 15 years. I wasn't a number 1. I didn't have a piece of the action. But I was learning a lot. I did the best job I could, and I studied the art of marketing and the art of direct marketing, which really paid off when the internet came around, and I was an internet entrepreneur. So, I think doing what you love is important, but it doesn't have to. Don't expect that you're going to get to this point of stardom where you're going to never have to do anything you don't love, because that's not reasonable. Everybody's got a day job or day job component to what they have to do in life.
Well, and that's the truth. I mean, that is reality. Even business owners, they have a lot of things they don't like doing, like you mentioned. There's a lot of stuff that, that's life. That's part of life. It's not all about, rainbows and unicorns,
Right. Yeah, that is for sure.
Well, Paul, where can our listeners learn more about your book and connect with you and be part of your community?
Well, we've got a website. The Divination Foundation has got divination.com. That's DIVI nation.com. And that's got all the information. It's got a link to the book site. The book site is intuitiveintelligence.org. And that's, like I said, linked from divination.com. And I've got a podcast that is archived on divination.com. And I've got a manifestation meditation process in the resources section. We got a lot of stuff there for people to benefit from. And there's a contact form for people that want to get in touch with me. Intuitiveintelligence.org is the site about the book, and the book's for sale, Barnes & Noble and Amazon and many small bookstores. It just came out. It's just being launched. And I encourage people to get the book, of course, and give it a review on Amazon, if you will. That would really help a lot. But I really appreciate being on your show. And more than that, Marianne, I appreciate you and what you're doing. It's fantastic. Moments with Marianne. It's a beautiful thing. And I have a sense that you're doing what you love in that.
Oh, that's so right. And thank you for your kind words. I love what I do. And it's easy to see that you love what you do. And I just love your story, too.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Intuitive Intelligence. Intuitive Intelligence is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.